don't y'all rise. Please be seated. Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Shakespeare on Trial, presenting the case of William Shakespeare, also known as Billy the Bard, versus John Thomas Looney. This is case number CV 2012-423 in the Circuit County of Pulaski, Elyria Division. Anyone here for the Delta Blues cases? That's not happening tonight. The parties and a witness for the defendant, Richard Burbage, have come back to life here in the Elyria Division of Pulaski County Circuit Court to put to rest the question of whether William Shakespeare was the true author of his plays. The plaintiff, William Shakespeare, has sued John Thomas Looney for defamation, claiming that Looney's scholarship falsely claims that Shakespeare did not write his plays. Mr. Looney refutes that he has defamed Shakespeare, arguing that his scholarship reveals the truth that Shakespeare could not have written his plays. And Mr. Looney relies on his own testimony as well as Richard Burbage's testimony for the defense. Now the fun part, 12 of you in the audience will serve as the jury and decide this very important question this evening. If you'll take a moment now and look under your seats, if you are one of the 12 lucky ones, you will have juror written at the bottom of your chair. It's taped. I am told by my bailiff that it's taped underneath the seat, so if you'll take a moment to All right, if you'll sit, I'll instruct you there, Mr. Juror. And there are no excuses for getting out of jury duty because District Judge Billy Roy Wilson over there will tend to anybody who wants to get out of jury duty. All right, if I may ask the 12 jurors if you'll please stand and take the oath. If you'll raise your right hands. Do you swear to perform your duties faithfully and honorably as jurors in this wonderful case? All right. All right, you may be seated. At the end of the evidence, you will be sequestered to our jury deliberation room. I'm serious. And all right, now what I think is the most boring part of trial, I've been instructed to give you all instructions, and I will briefly go over the opening instruction to let you all know how we will conduct our business today. I will be giving some instructions now about how you do your job as jurors. It will help you follow them if you understand a basic principle about how our justice system works. Ours is called the adversarial system. Each side brings in its evidence and makes its arguments in court. I instruct you on the law to be applied, and you wait until you've heard all the evidence and instructions before making up your mind. That way, all the parties know what all the evidence and law are in the case and have had an opportunity to examine and respond to them and to hear from all the parties. Opening statements. First, the attorneys will have a chance to give you their views about the evidence at trial. These are called opening statements. The attorney's opening statements are not evidence. They are made only to help you understand the evidence and the applicable law. Presentation of evidence. Next, the parties will bring their evidence into court. The introduction of evidence into court is governed by law. Evidence includes testimony of witnesses, exhibits, and anything else I instruct you to consider. What an attorney says or claims to have proven is not evidence. If such statements, arguments, or claims have no basis in the evidence, you should disregard them. Instructions. At times during the trial and after closing arguments, I will give you instructions as I'm doing now. It is my duty as judge to inform you of the law applicable to this case through such instructions. It's your sworn duty as jurors to accept and follow all of them. You are to consider the law only as instructed by me. Do not consider any other rule of law with which you may happen to be familiar. Closing arguments. After the evidence, the attorneys will have a chance to make their final remarks to you. These are called closing arguments. The attorney's closing arguments are not evidence. They are made only to help you understand the evidence and applicable law. deliberations. After I give you final instructions, you will then go to the jury room to discuss the case and to decide the question I will put on the verdict form. These discussions are called deliberations. Keep an open mind until after you've gone to the jury room to decide the case and you and your fellow jurors have discussed the evidence. So at this time, we will begin our case, and I'll ask counsel to enter their appearance and state who it is that you represent.
Great man, William Shakespeare.
Mr. Mann, welcome. Mr. Shakespeare.
Kathleen Compton for Mr. Loney, Your Honor.
And Sean Johnson, also for Mr. Loney, Your Honor.
All righty. Mr. Loney and counsel, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, opening statements.
For hundreds of years, Shakespeare, the word, the name, has been synonymous with the apotheosis of expression in our native tongue. All the world's a stage. Out, damn spot. To be or not to be. Make a mountain out of a molehill. There are hundreds of this man's expressions that are part of our very fiber. Now, in the 1920s, Mr. Loney published a book in which he advanced the lie that Edward de Vere authored these works. His lie has caused Mr. Shakespeare, has caused us all harm, putting a cloud on what we know to be true. Now, you will hear evidence from Mr. Shakespeare. You'll hear evidence from Mr. de Vere, or rather from Mr. Loney and Mr. Burbage. After you have heard this evidence, we will ask you to measure the harm in dollars and cents and award Mr. Shakespeare his just deserts.
Right on. Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. For Mr. Loney.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. Much ado about nothing.
Thank you.
In 1920, Mr. Loney, my client, Mr. John Thomas Loney, you may rise for the jury if you like, published the novel. The novel, of course, Shakespeare identified in Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And in this novel, what Mr. Loney uncovered was the importance of what this case is really about. That the true author of the plays known to be attributed to Mr. Shakespeare, or to a Shakespeare, were written by someone who had a poetic talent, someone who knew more of aristocrats than servants, favored them even, someone who had a superb education, someone who was well-traveled, perhaps to Italy, as so many of those plays were written from. Edward de Vere lived from 1550 to 1604, excuse me. 1550 to 1604. He was Cambridge educated, much as has been described. He was well-traveled to such places in continental Europe as Italy. He, like Prince Hamlet, had a father who had died and a mother who had remarried. Now, Shakespeare lived from 1564 until 1616, and his plays were not published in the first folio, or perhaps the plays that are attributed to a Shakespeare were not published until 7 years after his death in 1623. Now, some of his plays bear his name, but some do not. So I ask you as jurors, as you listen today, lend us your ears. I ask you at the end of this case, when the judge, His Honor, instructs you as to the preponderance of the evidence standard that you will use by which to judge the case, what is more likely than not? And I ask you, as you consider that, to consider three questions. The first being, is there proof that William Shakespeare wrote these plays? Proof. Is it possible that Oxford, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, wrote under the pseudonym William Shakespeare? And thirdly, is there proof that Mr. Loney wrote his book absolutely knowing that its contents were false? And I trust that as you consider those questions, and you consider it with your own common sense, we will ask you to find for the defendant. Thank you, Your Honor.
Counselor. For the plaintiff, you may present your case.
Call William Shakespeare.
Raise your right hand, please. You swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may see. I think it's for you.
Hello?
Hello? Oh, I could have used this 400 years ago. Oh, for a muse of fire.
Introduce yourself for the record, please, sir.
William Shakespeare.
Mr. Shakespeare, what do you do?
I am a playwright, primarily. I also acted in London during my lifetime. Also one of the householders and shareholders of the Lord Chamberlain's Men and a householder of the Globe Theatre. You may have heard of it.
And as a householder, what does that mean?
That means any performance that took place within our wooden O meant that I received a share of the profits, or losses, whatever the case may be.
Were these shows generally profitable?
When they were my plays, they were.
Now, in 1920, you heard a book was published. What can you tell the jury about this?
Yes. In 1920, Mr. Looney put forth a book that stated that I did not write my own plays. He put the credit to the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. Now, for the last 100 years or so, I've had to endure hearing things like that I didn't write my own plays, that someone else wrote it. They've even got movies about it, the Anonymous. And after seeing said film, I felt that the screenwriter should remain anonymous.
Now, in your plays, I've read a character say, "My dear Lord, the purest treasure mortal times afford is spotless reputation, that away men are but gilded loam or painted clay." Do these thoughts...
That's good.
It is good. Do these expressions represent those of a character, or do they hold some truth for you?
You know, one of my later countrymen, Oscar Wilde, once said that all art is autobiographical. So the things that I put in my character's mouth are certainly things that I felt from time to time. Now, certainly that doesn't mean I want to murder the King of England or anything like that.
No.
But there are certain truths, visceral truths, that I put in my character's mouths, and that certainly could be one of them.
What evidence might the jurors use to find that you were the true author?
Well, and you know, Mr. Looney might find this rather interesting.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. My client's name is Mr. Loney. This is not difficult to pronounce.
It is spelled like Looney.
It is spelled like Loney.
Up top, Judge.
Mr. Shakespeare. Loney.
Yeah. Mr. Looney, yes. Well, I'm sorry, Judge, what was the question?
The evidence
Oh,
of your
yes, the
authorship.
evidence. That I wrote my own plays.
Yes.
Well, yes, Mr. Loney might find it interesting that if you open up a book like Hamlet, Macbeth, you scroll to the title page and look down, my name is on it. Now, the prosecution said something about 7 years after my death. That's all well and good. But you must understand, in those days, publishing plays was just not something that we thought about. That we did from time to time, but mostly I profited artistically and financially when my plays were performed on the stage, not on the page. No one cared about that. There was no such thing as copyright back then. What would happen? Somebody like a group like the Lord Chamberlain's Men would say, hey, Bill, would you mind writing some type of story about two deranged lovers who want to become the king and queen of Scotland? I would say, jolly good, I'll do that. So, I would write the play, I would give it to the producers, and I would say, there you go, have at it, boys. I would help them out with the rehearsal period, and then that was that. What they did with it afterwards, I had nothing to do with. Sometimes they published it, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes other producers would come to the plays, sit in the audience with pen and paper in hand, and would write down the dialogue that the players spoke. They would then publish the plays, perform them in their own theaters. So this whole idea of authorship in the way that you know it now just didn't exist.
Well, now, these words were at one time then gathered into a writing.
Yes, the first folio. I had two good friends, Master Hemmings and Master Condell, who after my death compiled all the plays they could find and put it into a first folio edition for everybody to have through posterity.
How can we, the members of the jury as well, know that these individuals put your name on it? What's the association between these potential strangers and you?
Well, one thing that you can look at are records of the time. In my last will and testament, I left 26 shillings, 8 pence apiece to Master Condell and Master Hemmings to buy them rings. I don't know how many men you know buy other men rings. In those days, we had what you might call a bromance. So it was obvious we were rather close.
Now, a moment ago, you mentioned the title of one of your plays, Hamlet.
Yes.
You have a son.
I do have a son.
What's his name?
Hamnet.
Now, your education, I suspect, will be featured in your cross-examination. Tell us about your education.
Well, I went to grammar school, starting at age 7. But my mother could also read and write, and she taught me to do the same. Although I may have not gone to university, I grew up in grammar school where, in that time, we read and studied the Greek and Latin classics in their original language, things that university students today don't even do. So from that, from reading the classics in grammar school, and also from performing plays in grammar school, we always did a rousing version of Ralph Royster Doyster every year at school. From this experience is how I was able to coalesce all of my talents into making plays, making theater, and doing what I did best.
You also drew, did you not, from resources available to you in your native Warwickshire?
Oh, yes. If you look at my plays, there are allusions everywhere of stopped ovens and knitting and weaving and hooping and things of that nature. There was also Ophelia's flowers and Lear's flowers. If you look at what Oberon asked his servant to do in Midsummer Night's Dream, he says, go fetch some love and idleness. Well, that was simply what we called the pansy back in Warwickshire. So if you look through my plays, you'll find all kinds of allusions to country life, something that the 17th Earl of Oxford knew nothing of.
Finally, Mr. Shakespeare, I will show you a chart reflecting the box office receipts for your productions from 1920, when they
Maybe
were
you should show it to Loney as well.
$92 million a year your plays brought to houses. 77 million in 1960, 53 million in 1980, 31 million in 2000, and in 2011, $2 million. Do you recognize this exhibit, sir?
Yes, you just showed it to me.
Your Honor, I move proof of damages of Mr. Loney's lies into evidence.
Objections?
No objections, Your Honor.
Will be received.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Cross?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Shakespeare, good afternoon and happy 448th birthday.
He remembered.
Now, Mr. Shakespeare, just a moment ago, you mentioned that some of your plays bore your name and that we should somehow know that they are attributed to you because of that. Is that correct?
Yes?
And in your plays, you do admit that some of them do not bear your name?
In the folio, or?
No, prior to that, Mr. Shakespeare.
Oh, yes, yes.
So if I understand that correctly for the jury, some of your works do not reflect your name, that you alleged are your works do not reflect your name, and yet others do. Am I correct in saying that?
I suppose you could put it that way.
So that's a yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, regarding your education, you mentioned that you went to grammar school.
Yes.
And in grammar school, you learned such things as the classics.
Yes.
You learned your English tongue.
Yes.
Do you learn mathematics?
A little bit.
All the things a schoolboy learns.
Yes.
And you expect the jury to believe that based upon that education, that you could then author such sonnets as you've included in all of your works.
Yes.
All of these fellow school children that you attended grammar school with in Stratford,
Yes.
all of these fellow school children, did they also write such works and produce such wonderful pieces of art?
I should certainly say not.
Indeed. So you have no university education.
No.
Now, I take it that you have reviewed the work that is at issue here. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you know of the allegations or the averments of Mr. Loney in his volume.
Yes.
You're aware that he has characterized the writer of the plays that you claim to be yours as a recognized genius and poetic talent.
He was right about one thing.
And you recognize that he alleges that the person who wrote the plays was mysterious and eccentric
Yes.
and had a superb education.
Well, education can be got in many ways.
But you do know that he alleges that the person had a superb education.
A superb education. Certainly, he alleges that, yes.
And that the individual was an aristocrat.
Well, yes, you can read the whole book to me, sir.
Or at least I should say, felt more akin or liked aristocrats better than the servant class.
He certainly seems to think so.
And finally, you recognize that Mr. Loney in his volume says that the writer of the works would have traveled extensively in Italy. Are you aware of that?
I am aware of it.
Well,
But I must say, sir, you're James Cameron. Correct me if I'm wrong, counselor, but I don't believe he actually traveled to Pandora and interviewed blue aliens to come up with Avatar. And contrary to popular belief, Charlton Heston never went to a planet of the apes.
And perhaps the subject of another suit. But perhaps, let me ask you, with regard to the superb education, you do recognize that not attending university could perhaps disadvantage one when it comes to determining whether they have a superb education in this regard of this work?
I suppose if that's the way you choose to define superb education, I would think life experience was just as good education as attending many years of university.
And you've never traveled through the continent, to continental Europe. Am I correct, Mr. Shakespeare?
Well, I did my fair share of traveling. There are some fuzzy years in there.
And so you've never traveled to Italy?
Well, I believe that that's something that, again, would fall under those fuzzy years. Some people might take some records and find that people within my acting company have traveled abroad extensively. Unfortunately, no records like that for me exist.
And then based upon the travels of others, you allege that you were able to produce such works as The Merchant of Venice, which is set in Venice, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Romeo and Juliet, set in Siena. Is that what you allege?
Yes, but remember, Hamlet, King of Denmark, Orsino, the Duke of Illyria. These are places that, even if I hadn't traveled to, they were still in my plays, and it didn't matter whether I'd been there or not.
Well, let's move on, Mr. Shakespeare. You do admit, don't you, that it's a possibility that the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, merely used the name William Shakespeare as a pseudonym, do you not?
Well, it's possible, but it's also impossible to prove.
And it's impossible to disprove, is it not?
Well, I'll give you Exhibit A to whether I exist.
Now, just a moment ago, Mr. Shakespeare, you discussed with your counsel and presented to the court an exhibit showing your gross receipts since, I believe, the beginning of the last century. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think for the court it was Exhibit A?
Yes, sir.
And Exhibit A, which you were shown, this exhibit is based upon the International Association of Shakespeare Festivals gross receipts. Is that correct?
Yes.
But what, Mr. Shakespeare, about all the royalties and other things from all the plays and all of the different box offices that exist around the world do you have to gain as opposed to simply the Shakespeare festivals alone?
What do I have to show for that?
Well, do you have other performances that take place throughout the world?
Of course, Shakespeare's performed all over the world.
And those royalties go to you in some way, or they're attributed to you?
Objection,
What
Your
is-
Honor, this is argumentative.
I withdraw the
Overruled.
question. I withdraw the question, Your Honor. Finally, to close, Mr. Shakespeare, you allege, I believe, that your reputation has been diminished by the work of Mr. Loney. Is that correct?
Yes.
And yet, throughout the world, you recognize that your plays are performed on a daily basis.
Yes.
So, with those two things in mind, you would recognize that it's difficult to see how your reputation has been diminished, even though it is so profoundly performed according to all the playwrights or playhouses in the world.
Well, I'll tell you something interesting I found today. I got on what you might call the internet and Googled myself. I came across something called Wikipedia. In this article, you can scroll down. I believe it's called scrolling down. Scroll down, and you'll find a section talking about if Shakespeare actually wrote his plays. And I posit to you, sir, that 20 years ago, that section of the article would never have been there. It's through these conferences, it's through his publications, and it's through his speculations that have gone on and on that they've become popular enough to put on the internet.
But one little last question, Mr. Shakespeare. Your work, even though you allege that it is so diminished, you do recognize that even as recently as today, the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, has proclaimed it Talk Like Shakespeare Day, April 23rd, 2012. The second largest city in the United States has declared it that. Do you still allege that when the mayor of Chicago says that we are reminded of Shakespeare's indelible influence throughout timeless works and a contribution of 1,700 words and innumerable phrases to the English language, including but not limited to, quote, lackluster, quote, eyeball, and brevity is the soul of wit, do you still maintain that your reputation has been diminished by a work from 1920 by Mr. Loney?
Well, Mr. Emanuel was very kind, but I would still say yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Is there anything further from this witness?
No, Your Honor, and the plaintiff rests.
All right. You may stand down, sir. And tonight's a perfect night to be enrolled at the Clinton School, get your Master's of Public Administration to shore up those educational issues. The dean is here. You might speak to him later. For Mr. Loney.
Your Honor, I would call Mr. J.T. Loney.
Oh. You raise your right hand, please. You swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Indeed I do.
You may sit, please, with the microphone.
Mr. Loney, would you address the jury and tell them your full name, please?
My name is John Thomas Loney. Not Looney, thank you. But most people call me JT for short.
And Mr. Loney, I'm from the southernmost part of the state of Illyria. Can you understand my accent all right?
I think so.
All right. Now, tell me what you did for a living before 1920.
I was a schoolmaster.
And in 1920, did you stop being a schoolmaster?
Indeed.
What did you do in 1920?
Well, I took to doing some research on Shakespeare, who I've been fond of for a very long time, the plays of Shakespeare, the collected works of William Shakespeare. And I discovered that I believe Shakespeare did not actually, this William Shakespeare, did not actually write the plays, so I set out to publish my findings in the book. Shakespeare identified in Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford.
Is this your book, Mr. Loney?
Indeed it is.
Tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury who Edward de Vere is, or was.
Edward de Vere was the 17th Earl of Oxford. He was born in 1550. Became the 17th Earl in 1562. He was well-traveled, known to have traveled to Italy in the 1570s. He was an aristocrat, very well-educated. He went to Cambridge University, a very good education, if I do say so myself. And from there, he became was known to be a poet. I myself, in fact, have published some of the poems of Edward de Vere that he put his own name to.
And the basic premise of your book is that it was not William Shakespeare, the plaintiff, but William Shakespeare, the Oxford, who wrote these plays that we're all so familiar with. Is that correct?
That is indeed correct. I find it very difficult to believe that this man, whom you've just seen behaving like a clown, could possibly have written such works as Romeo and Juliet, Richard III, Twelfth Night, Hamlet. Please.
And on what do you base this idea that he simply could not have been the author of these plays?
Well, my dear lady, you simply read the plays. You read them, you open them up as this man said so himself. And you look at them and you begin to understand certain characteristics that the playwright would have had to have possessed. First of all, he must have been a divine poet, as the Earl of Oxford was. Moreover, he would have been extremely eccentric and quite an interesting fellow. But also, he definitely would have been an aristocrat. After all, the playwright clearly favors kings and queens over slaves and servants.
And is there anything else, anything in the life of Oxford, the Earl of de Vere, that is similar to any of the characters in Shakespeare's plays?
There are so many things. I don't even know where to begin. As this gentleman over here mentioned at the beginning.
Your lawyer over here?
Yes. Forgive me. As you were saying before, of course, that just like Hamlet, De Vere's father had died and his mother had remarried. Like King Lear, Edward de Vere had 3 daughters. Like Romeo and Juliet, De Vere's wife was the same age as Juliet when they married.
Well, I guess what I need for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury to understand from you is, given the body of work, given how popular it's been over the last 400 and some odd years, why wouldn't Oxford simply take credit for it?
Oh my goodness, the plays are full of political allegory. And it would be impossible for a member of the aristocracy to ascribe his name to these plays. It would have been dangerous for him. He would have been ostracized. He would have gotten into tons and tons of trouble.
You are aware, are you not, Mr. Loney, that Mr. Shakespeare's name and visage are on the first folio of the plays as published?
I am indeed aware, and of course...
And what do you make of that?
Oh, I make very little of that.
How is that?
Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, needed to have a person to ascribe the plays to. If they had been printed completely anonymously, people would wonder who the author was. They were so magnificent. So it made perfect sense to find a person to put his visage on it and to ascribe his name to it. But if I do say so myself, only 9 of the quartos, that is, individual versions of the plays, actually bore this man, William Shakespeare's name. But also, I must say that William Shakespeare, this William Shakespeare, was not necessarily the only William Shakespeare. It is my opinion that this William Shakespeare was not actually this man at all.
But who?
The Earl of Oxford.
There is a problem with your theory that I would like you to explain to the jury, and that is that Oxford died in 1604, and many of the famous plays of William Shakespeare occurred after that time. How do you explain this discrepancy in dates?
Well, if the jurors find this a problem, they clearly have no imagination. No. It's quite simple. It's quite simple. The bulk of the plays were written before 1604, and in fact, it's quite possible that those that were published or produced after 1604 were simply finished before he died and published and produced later. Or perhaps he left them unfinished and they were completed by another playwright. Or, in the case of The Tempest, who we call William Shakespeare, did not write that play at all. I don't believe that was written by the same person that wrote the rest of them.
Could you give us just a brief rundown of famous people we might be familiar with who are Oxfordians, that is, people who believe in the premise of your book?
Oh, there are several. Upon the publication of my book and its reading by many great minds, many people have ascribed to it. Take, for instance, Mark Twain, a name you might be familiar with. Sigmund Freud, although I must say I'm a bit uncomfortable with that old chap. Helen Keller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, all of these great minds, many of which wonderful writers themselves, believe that the Earl of Oxford has written these plays.
Thank you, Mr. Loney. I have no further questions.
Cross.
Now, Mr. Loney, in his opening statement, your lawyer referred to your book as a novel. Do you propose that it's a work of pure fiction or of some scholarship?
Indeed, I do not. I would call his characterization of it as a novel to be incorrect, probably just a mistake that he made.
You were a schoolmaster.
I was.
Until 1920, I believe, when you said you took to researching the question of the authorship.
Indeed, I even established a group to do just that, the Shakespeare Fellowship.
Fine.
You may be familiar with it.
I may be. This research that you began in 1920, you then published in a book in 1920.
Yes.
You took all of a year to do your extensive research.
Oh no, I have been a student of the collected works of William Shakespeare for a long time.
Oh, so now you say you took to the research sometime before.
Oh, forgive me, I misspoke. What I meant to say is
Yes.
I actually
now,
took to
your
publishing.
education, your premise is that education, life experience, and real genius are the things you use to prove Mr. de Vere's true authorship. Is that right?
Particularly aristocratic experience, not general life experience.
Not just life, aristocratic. Now, are there any other factors you use to make your case?
Well, of course, as I laid out, the various connections between the plays, the subject of them, and Edward de Vere's life.
The experiences. All right, then. Now, education. You mentioned, or you heard Mr. Shakespeare's testimony that many of his plays reveal an intimate familiarity with terms familiar only to a Warwickshire native, the casual, the inside terminology for plants and flowers and fauna. How would you explain Mr. de Vere's familiarity with these regionalisms?
Mr. de Vere was exceedingly well-traveled, as a member of the aristocracy could be.
And he was well-traveled to the groups of people that one would characterize not as aristocratic, but regular people of the street as well.
He may very well have passed through Warwickshire.
He very may well have passed through. Now, life experiences. Well, let's actually look at the question of genius. Do you need a fine education to be a genius?
I would not say that you need a fine education to have some of those tendencies, but you need a fine education to refine them in such a way that the writer of William Shakespeare's plays did.
Do you need to be a genius, life experiences of the aristocrat to be a genius?
No, but the experiences of an aristocrat allow one to become acquainted with the aristocracy and the wealthy people and the kings and queens, such that William Shakespeare wrote about quite a bit.
You, being a knowledgeable fellow, are familiar with a musician, a homeschooled fellow named Mozart.
Yes.
And when he was 3, he was playing. And when he was 5, he was composing. And he had composed a symphony by age 8 and an opera at 14. And by the time he was 35, he had composed 600 works, this homeschool boy. And how do you explain that?
Oh, my dear man. Writing music is very different from writing a play. To understand music, you must write music.
Now,
you understand music, a play, you have to understand not only how the theater works, you also have to understand the human condition, you have to understand, different classes.
Now,
very different from writing a piece of music.
Let me ask you about a Swiss patent clerk in the early part of the last century. A fellow named Einstein wrote a paper about the theory of relativity. How do you explain that, sir? Physics, that's nothing like writing English.
Did he write about the theory of relativity in iambic pentameter? Did he write about the theory of relativity with two people in conversation? Did he write about the theory of relativity in the context of kings and queens? No, he did not. He wrote it in scientific, whatever scientists write about. I'm not a scientist.
These days, Mr. Loney, there is popular among our culture a television program called Downton Abbey. And there are folks that live an aristocratic life, and there are those downstairs that serve them, many of them. And in this story, sir, these people downstairs are exposed to the life of the aristocracy.
Objection to leading continuously, Your Honor.
It is cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, these downstairs folks have friends in town. They write letters. They exchange information. Is it not possible that these folks who were around aristocrats actually were able to share some of these rare secrets of the aristocracy?
So I understand correctly that you assume that William Shakespeare had a pen pal.
He had a pen.
Indeed. There is absolutely no evidence that any of that took place.
Thank you, Your Honor. I rest my cause.
Is there anything further of this witness?
There's not, Your Honor.
Sir, you may stand down. Thank you. Do you have additional proof?
Your Honor, we would call Mr. Richard Burbage.
Mr. Burbage? Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I swear.
You may sit with the microphone.
Did you say $92 million?
Yes.
Mr. Burbage, you're going to have to talk really fast because Mr. Shakespeare's lawyer took up most of my time.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Would you state your name and where you're employed, please?
My name is Richard Burbage. I am employed by the Lord Chamberlain's men. I'm a shareholder and householder, as well as a householder in the Globe Theatre, along with William Shakespeare.
Are you an actor?
I am indeed. As a matter of fact, it's funny you should ask. I'm considered by many to be one of the foremost actors of the Elizabethan age. In fact, even some of my, shall we say, rivals in the theater respected me to the point where my gravestone actually reads, "Exit Burbage," something I'm rather proud of.
Where were you raised, Mr. Burbage?
I was born and raised in Stratford-on-Avon, not far at all from William Shakespeare.
And are you and Mr. Shakespeare friends?
Ah, absolutely. We're very close friends and colleagues in the theater.
What about the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere? Are you acquainted with the Earl of Oxford?
Earl of Oxford, not personally acquainted, but a friend of the family. The de Veres and my family are quite closely acquainted through my father, James Burbage, who was one of the founders, shall we say, of the Elizabethan theatre, one of the founders of the London Theatre. In fact, the first theatre, called The Theatre, was built by my father, James Burbage, and patronized by the de Veres.
Which theater was that?
The Theatre.
Which theater?
Correct.
The theater?
The Theatre.
The theater. All right.
Exactly.
Now, so is it fair to say that Oxford was an enthusiastic attendee at many of the performances?
Oh, absolutely. Oxford often appeared as an audience member at the productions in the Globe Theatre, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and various other theatres in London.
But you don't have a personal relationship with him?
I would not call my relationship with him personal, although he's certainly been a patron and a supporter of the theatre in London.
And does Oxford write?
Oh, he's very well known as an excellent poet.
Okay. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about being an actor in the theater. Would you always read an entire script when it was brought in?
Oh, well, in my position as, shall we say, an impresario, that is, I own 25% of the Globe Theatre, for example. My older brother Cuthbert owns 25%. So in that position, we may very well see an entire script, but for the normal actor, for example, when I was starting out as a young man, 20 years old, I rarely saw a full script. It's too time-consuming. Think about it. You have 15 actors on a stage to copy out 15 scripts, and those scripts undergo changes. Impossible. So each actor normally receives his own
Burbage,
sides.
Excuse me,
Yes.
who wrote the plays that you performed?
Oh my, that's a difficult question.
Yes, who wrote them?
Well, normally, we would receive a commission, or we would lend a commission to a playwright, and the playwright would produce a script. Now, that's just the first step of the process. The next step of the process would be for us to read the script, perhaps suggest changes, depending on what we were asking for. But then, once we had decided as a company on the proper form of the script, we had to bring it to the Master of Revels, who had ultimate authority for licensing the script and the ultimate power to censor the script. And this was a quite normal process. Now, once it got to the Master of Revels, it might also go to the Lord Chamberlain or several other members of the court to actually read the script, vet it, and eventually, after seeing perhaps a rehearsal or two, the script would make its way back to us with suggested changes, at which point it would be changed and hopefully licensed, and then we would produce the script. Now, that was not the end of it.
It takes a village to write the play?
Oh, excellent. Are you a playwright? What are you talking you have?
What about messenger boys? Did you ever receive scripts from messenger boys?
Messenger boys. Well, the scripts would come to us in a variety of ways. We might receive a script from the playwright directly, might read before us, or a script might be delivered. Shakespeare, for example, is quite busy. Ben Jonson, Marlowe, they're all very busy playwrights.
You don't know who wrote Hamlet, do you?
Hamlet. Oh, that was written by William Shakespeare.
Which one?
Well, as I said, that's a difficult question. No, as I recall, that one was delivered by a messenger boy to us. I don't recall if Shakespeare gave that to us directly, but...
Thank you, Mr. Burbage, that's all.
Thank you.
Cross.
Yes.
I'd like to examine this valuable testimony that you've brought to us just a little bit. Let's see if I can understand the gist of your testimony.
I'd be happy to help you understand in any way I can.
Thank you. I understand that you say that the plays were not the work of a single individual.
Correct.
They were the contributions of Mr. Shakespeare?
Perhaps. Mr. Shakespeare, well, oftentimes in our theater, playwrights collaborated. There were many collaborations, in fact, that we did not even know who was collaborating at one time. Think of yourself as being in a position where you're asked to write 3 different plays within 2 weeks for 3 different theaters. Now, you go to your colleagues, like Marlowe or Johnson, you say, look, I've got a little problem here. I don't know whether to put this in Verona or Padua. What would you suggest? And then Johnson might say, well, let me work on it a few days and I'll give you something. So we saw a lot of this back and forth going on.
Might change the place of the play.
Perhaps changing a place, perhaps suggesting a change in character, additional characters, killing somebody off. Depends. These were creative artists, after all, collaborating for the good of the London theater.
Now, these collaborations came from, the contributions in this collaboration came from the Master of Revels.
Absolutely.
And came from the actors.
Absolutely.
And the actors were different actors in every one of the plays, weren't they?
Oh, well, they were indeed, although I must say that for most of William Shakespeare's plays, especially the tragedies, I did play the leading role. I actually originated Hamlet, Othello, Richard III. Those were all my work at first.
I'll come back to the Richard III in a moment, sir. In addition to the collaboration of the Master of Revels and the actors in one play after another, the authors included the messenger boys.
Well, the messenger boys might have been a factor. By messenger boy, I simply mean that sometimes a play would be delivered and we couldn't definitely attribute it to a particular playwright, especially it had been passed back and forth between several. By the time it got to us, well, we were really there to decide whether that was the play we wanted to produce.
By the village that it took to author it.
Exactly.
Now, Richard III. This is a play with some longevity, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
In fact, it's being performed locally, is it not?
Yes, your very own Arkansas Shakespeare Theater is producing it this summer.
And tickets are available on the web at www.arkshakes.com, are they not?
Why, I believe you're correct, arkshakes.com.
I'm done with this witness, Your Honor.
Anything further of this witness besides the shameless promotion?
No, Your Honor. And the defendant rests.
All right. Closing arguments?
Your Honor, I'll reserve most of my closing for my rebuttal. You've heard the evidence, you've heard the facts, you've heard the testimony. You can judge the credibility of these witnesses for yourself and the quality of the testimony. Use common sense. You'll be, if you'll recall, you have been instructed. Common sense will guide you. Look at the circumstantial evidence. All right. Look at the circumstantial evidence. Hamlet. The familiarity with things that common sense tells you an aristocrat wouldn't know from the Warwickshire countryside. Now, you've seen the damage that has been caused. And we will ask you in a moment to render a verdict of substantial consequence. I reserve the rest for rebuttal, Your Honor.
And because it's Mr. Shakespeare's burden of proving his case, he is allowed a rebuttal, a response to the defense.
May it please the court, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we'll turn now to another writer, since we've been on such lofty subject matter all night, and that would be Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott wrote these words, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive." Mr. Shakespeare has woven himself a tangled web when he set out some 400-odd years ago to deceive both the general public and Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth. Not satisfied with his lowly station in life, he created a fantasy world in which he, of course, was the star. And now, upon being outed for the fraud he is and always has been, he brings this frivolous lawsuit against our client. Well, methinks he doth protesteth too much. Yes, something is rotten in the state of Illyria. Mr. Shakespeare's complaint is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, but tainted by the mere truth. He is and always has been a fraud. So now it's time to tell him once and for all, out, damned spot, out, damned lie. You will be instructed by Judge Volpe to use your common sense and not set it aside when you go to the jury room, and to be true to yourself. Once you've been instructed by Judge Volpe, you will be given a verdict form to take with you into the jury room. The verdict form starts by saying, do you find by preponderance of the evidence that John Thomas Loney published a false statement of fact about William Shakespeare that caused harm to Shakespeare's reputation? You will write in there, no, and then you'll be finished and may go home, which I know you're ready to do because Mr. Shakespeare's lawyer went on too long. However, if your answer to that question should be yes, which I can't imagine could happen, you will go on and answer the rest of these questions, and the only one then that will matter would be to state the amount of damages that you find that Shakespeare is entitled to from Mr. Loney. Now, Judge Volpe will give you another instruction that says, if you choose to give damages to Mr. Shakespeare, but you can't decide upon a proper amount, then you may give what the law calls nominal damages. I think $1 would do. You're not going to get there because you will have answered the first interrogatory no. But even though Judge Volpe will tell you you must set aside your personal prejudices, if you're feeling a little sympathetic for Mr. Shakespeare and you decide you want to grant damages, just simply write in here $1 and no shillings. Thank you very much.
A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, really. Consider, imagine, if I had introduced myself this evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Adolf Hitler, counsel for the plaintiff, Billy Shakespeare. Now, everything you would have heard after that would have been filtered through a different screen, because everything that we perceive is filtered by the thing that came before it. Now, you've heard that Mr. Shakespeare's plays are still read and performed, and that therefore there's hardly any harm here. And you have heard that the mayor of one of our cities, the second largest, made today a special day. Well, that's lovely. Consider what our world would have been like had not Loney's lies infected our consciousness with this filth. If we had carried with us the purity of Lend me your ears. These are the words from defense counsel today. Lend me your ears. Much ado about nothing. Eyeballs. Brevity is the soul of wit. The eyeball something, not eyeballs. Brevity is the soul of wit. Sound and fury signifying nothing. Well, the defense has proven damages far better than a chart. And so I ask, as you go back to consider the harm to Mr. Shakespeare, measured through your own experiences, how can you express truly with full voice the harm of Loney's lies? Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. All right, if I may have your indulgence for just a few more minutes, because we all agree, albeit very eloquently, counsel has taken up too much time. I would like to give our jurors some parameters very briefly, and then I'll ask the jurors, they'll excuse themselves, they'll go over to our deliberation area, and then we'll have a question and answer session for our witnesses and our attorneys. The first instruction is that, as the lawyers have told you, you may consider your common sense. You have a right to consider all the evidence in light of your own observations and experiences in life's affairs. You are the sole judges of the credibility of the witnesses, so it's up to you to determine who is being truthful and who is not. Mr. Shakespeare, as I told you, has a burden of proof. That means he has the burden of establishing by a preponderance of the evidence that, and what this means is, that's the greater weight of the evidence, all right? It is the evidence which, when weighed with all opposed to it, has more convincing force and is more probably true and accurate. Now, the elements that you must consider are, first, that Mr. Shakespeare has sustained damages. Second, that Mr. Loney published a false statement of fact concerning Mr. Shakespeare. Third, that the statement of fact was defamatory, and I'll explain that more thoroughly in a moment. Fourth, that the publication of the statement was the proximate cause of Shakespeare's damages, meaning that the statement actually was the reason why Mr. Shakespeare was injured. Fifth, the burden is also on Mr. Shakespeare, if he makes it through all those four elements, to prove by clear and convincing evidence that Mr. Loney published the defamatory fact knowing it was false or with a high degree of awareness of its probable falseness. Now, I told you I would tell you about defamatory. A defamatory statement is a statement of fact that is false and actually causes harm to a person's reputation. In determining whether the statement was defamatory, it must be considered as a whole, and the words must be taken in their plain and natural meaning. Finally, counsel talked to you about nominal damages. Mr. Shakespeare contends that, and has the burden of proving that Mr. Loney's defamation approximately caused him actual damages as opposed to nominal damages. Nominal damages means a small sum awarded due to a violation of and to vindicate a person's legal right. If you find from the evidence in this case that Mr. Shakespeare is entitled to recover for defamation, then he's entitled to recover the actual damages shown by the evidence to have been proximately caused by Loney's wrongful conduct. If, however, you find that Shakespeare has failed to prove actual damages, or you cannot ascertain the amount from the evidence, Shakespeare is nevertheless entitled to recover, and you should award him nominal damages. All right, if I'll ask my jurors to please rise, and if you will exit from my left, your right. You gave me the exhibit, thank you, sir. Now, I'm told that we're not going to wait more than 7 hours for deliberations to complete. But now that our jury has excused themselves, if members of our audience have questions for our esteemed witnesses or attorneys. Yes, sir, in the blue. And can Get a microphone coming right here in the blue.
I did have a question. Wasn't Shakespeare play on words on Edward de Vere's father-in-law's name?
It would make sense.
Gentleman in the front here. Do you want to expound on that at all?
Oh, no, I think he did quite well.
Mr. Loney, I would like to know what kind of education you have and if you can read Latin and Greek.
Well, indeed I can. And now, I do want to be very clear because I think you're leading me into a trap. My background is not dissimilar from this man, William Shakespeare's. My father was not a glover, as his father was. My father was a shoemaker. But I am not claiming to have written such divine works of poetic language as he has. So my education, I should say, is irrelevant in this case. Well, indeed, my scholarship, yes, sure. But regardless of whether or not I am going to match the education of one like Edward de Vere, that's not the question. I am not the one on trial here.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Shakespeare, among yourself, Kit Barlow, and Ben Jonson, who got the most chicks?
I'll leave that to you to decide.
It was Mark.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Shakespeare, I read somewhere that you got a lot of the geographic things wrong in your plays, and that helped to prove why that you hadn't really traveled to these places. Why did you not bring that out in your testimony?
Well, I didn't know that they were wrong.
Judge Wilson.
Mr. Shakespeare, is it true that you stole lines shamelessly from other writers that wrote before your time?
Stole lines, as in the words a character might say. I don't recall doing that either. However, I will say that it was a common practice among many playwrights to take tales from years gone by and putting them into a different form, giving the characters new life, changing the story around a little bit. You can look at the classics and then look at something like my Comedy of Errors and see quite a similarity there. But as far as I think that I'm able to say, none of the lines in my play were direct copies or stolen, sounds like something Loney would say, stolen from any other playwright.
In the gallery, sir.
I wonder if Mr. Loney could tell us why the Earl of Oxford went to Cambridge.
Well, wouldn't you?
Yes, ma'am. Hold on, if you hold on 1 second with a microphone so everyone can hear the question.
I would like to ask Mr. Loney why he has concentrated on the Earl of Oxford. Ben Jonson has been named as a writer of Shakespeare's plays. Christopher Marlowe, they were not aristocrats. Why don't you think that your case is built on intellectual snobbery, or perhaps just snobbery itself?
I'll refrain from responding to that direct insult to my person. However, the Earl of Oxford has all of the qualities that I found to be necessary in the writer of the plays. Now, some of those other people that you mentioned, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, they were wonderful playwrights. However, they were not, I think most of us here would say they do not have the lasting and brilliant qualities that Shakespeare had. He was above and beyond them. And by Shakespeare, of course, I mean the Earl of Oxford. By the way, when I refer to Shakespeare, I'm talking about the collected works of William Shakespeare, a bit more, hazy kind of out there phrase than actually referring to the person Shakespeare itself. So it has to do with the brilliance of Shakespeare over Marlowe and Johnson.
Judge Fleming.
In a nutshell, what characteristics of The Tempest convince you that it was not written by the other guy, whoever the other guy was?
Oh, it has to do with the language, it has to do with the characters, it has to do with all kinds of things. That I would go on, but I'm afraid that I would be remiss in doing so and distracting the audience from some of their questions.
Yes, ma'am, in the pink.
My question has to do not with plays, but with sonnets. And I wondered if when you were in school, if you had an English teacher who taught you what iambic pentameter was so that you would know how to write your sonnets.
Well, we certainly had fantastic teachers. Of course, I think teachers are one of the most valuable resources that we can have. Not saying that you are a teacher or anything like that, a wink, wink. But, however, I will say that I did have a proper grammar school education. As far as iambic pentameter went, that was actually something that was developed during my lifetime. It wasn't necessarily something that had always been around. And so it was actually the style of the day to write things in iambic pentameter. You can look at earlier works and later works and see when that change started to happen.
In the back there, ma'am.
Mr. Loney, how has your theory been acknowledged or accepted by those individuals in the academic world who had devoted their lives to the study of Shakespeare and his works? Particularly individuals in institutions of higher learning like Oxford and Cambridge.
I do have to say there is still a lot of skepticism over it, although it has been embraced by some. And I would say that has to do with, more to do with tradition than it has to do with the facts.
I think this was mentioned earlier, but I wanted to ask for a point of clarification. If your book is found in some of the libraries still, is it classified as fiction or nonfiction?
I do wonder that myself. Having not been into a library of the 21st century, I cannot say for sure.
What does the library tag say on the corner there?
Neither.
In the back, yes, ma'am.
May I ask, to verify your work, did you speak with any of the descendants of the Earl of Oxford?
No, not per se. But he was trying to keep himself unknown. It was an intentional thing to keep himself unknown. So it would not have made sense for all of them to be in on something together, or he might have been revealed.
Any other?
There's a question up there.
Oh, up in the back.
I think the revelation of the truth is the largest profit one can get.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Loney, quite popular
by a female. For example, by Queen Elizabeth herself. And there are many reputable critics in the present time who are following that line of argument, including somebody like Kristen Linklater, who believes that, in fact, the plays were written by Shakespeare's sister.
Well, I do appreciate that view. I appreciate also that feminism has come quite far in the past 90 years. However, I would say that I have looked at the poems of Queen Elizabeth, and they are marvelous, but when compared to the writings of William Shakespeare, they just are not at the same level. And if you look at the poems of Edward de Vere, they are also marvelous, and Edward de Vere has even written into some of his poems the idea that he is not who he seems to be. There is a poem whose title is something like "I am not as I seem." He has also written a poem, I think it's about 26 lines, in iambic pentameter, which the subject is that the person who writes something does not get the credit. He devoted 26 rhyming lines to this idea that the writer does not get the credit. I don't believe Queen Elizabeth has written something in that way.
I understand our jury is just about concluded. Is that correct? We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Do you have any direct evidence, and did Edward de Vere ever write any plays?
I do not have any more direct evidence of Edward de Vere having written the plays than William Shakespeare of Stratford has that he wrote the plays.
Yes, sir.
I would like to put it to Mr. Shakespeare that you have chosen to reincarnate yourself 400 years later simply so that you could play with Gwyneth Paltrow.
Well, I don't see any harm in doing that, do you?
Mr. Pippa?
Mr. Shakespeare, in adapting to iambic pentameter, did you consciously decide to break with the 10-syllable line more frequently than Johnson and Marlowe did, or was that just a happy accident?
I don't believe it's a happy accident. During my later works, you'll find more and more that I stray here and stray there in different plays. You'll find short lines, you'll find feminine endings, you'll find stoppages in the middle of lines. Honestly, if you look at the work of great artists, during their later years, during their more mature era, they will start to experiment. So you can see the progression of my plays. If you look at something like The Comedy of Errors, which, as delightful as I think it is, some scholars have said that it is inferior to a play like Hamlet, which I certainly wrote later on in my career. So you can track my career in that way. So yes, it was a conscious decision.
I would add that messenger boys don't always count syllables. Well,
All right, as our jurors file back in, they have rendered a verdict, and I have the form, and the jury has come back with a defense verdict. So they apparently paid good attention to you and how to fill the form out, Ms. Compton. So, Mr. Shakespeare, I'm sorry, but there's no verdict today for you, and you've had your day in court. And I thank our members of the jury and our wonderful people that have attended, and we'll be adjourned.
So, even though we did not find in Mr. Shakespeare's case, I'm very sorry to hear that today, we still would like to celebrate his birthday. And in his honor, we have a delightful cake and slices for everyone. So if you're interested in having a piece of cake, please file that way for some birthday cake for Shakespeare. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight.